this word before, and if so, you were likely told that the amygdala is the fear center of the brain. A lot of neuroscientists, even, will simplify the structure to that description, especially when they're talking to the general public. However, I am here today to disabuse you of that notion. We know a lot about the amygdala at this point, and I can tell you it's doing much more than just processing feelings of fear. In fact, the amygdala being so important to fear processing has much more to do with the function of fear rather than the function of the amygdala. Let's start with a little bit of neuroanatomy. And I do mean little. The amygdala is a very small structure. Its name is derived from the Latin word for almond, which about describes the size and shape of it in an adult human brain. Like many structures in your brain, the amygdala is bilateral, meaning it shows up in both sides or hemispheres. Though we often call this thing the amygdala, the current research indicates that it's divided into several functionally distinct parts. Each part of the amygdala has been implicated in different jobs, only some of which are related to fear and threat processing. Parts of the amygdala are also involved in sexual arousal, metabolic stuff like hunger and thirst, memory, dealing with social information, reward, aggression, and emotional and evaluative processing generally, not just fear specifically. It's by no means a one-trick pony. So why does the amygdala frequently get labeled a fear center if it's doing so much more than that? Well, because it is essential to fear processing. People and animals with damage to their amygdalas have trouble appropriately experiencing fear and recognizing fear in the faces and body language of others. They also struggle to properly form memories that depend on those feelings to stick. The amygdala is very important to emotion generally, not just fear, and damage to it can lead to complex consequences that we're still discovering. In order to study what the amygdala is responsible for in humans, researchers often have to seek out people who have had strokes or otherwise experienced some damage to that specific area of the brain. That process takes a while, but there is a rich history of case studies at this point. Additionally, the imaging technology scientists use to observe the amygdala's various parts is improving, such that we're learning more and more about the finer-grained details of its anatomy and function all the time. Moving forward here, though I hope I've been upfront about the amygdala being activated by much more than fear, it is still essential to fear processing, and fear is generally important to life, so we'll dwell on that for a bit longer. Fear is, of course, critical to survival. It lets you know when you are or might be in danger. This was selected for, in an evolutionary sense. It's consistent across species. I mean, it's obviously adaptive for you or any other creature to be alert to things that might be a threat to you above all else. You'll swim through sewage to escape a bear if you have your priorities straight. But because it's so important, it's also very noticeable or salient to you. And that's good to an extent, but as you might imagine, fear is a thing that people might try to hijack for their own purposes because they know how powerful it is. Most everyone can be led around by their fears.
Look at the clown. Look at the clown.
To summarize the neuroscience perspective on this, it is good for people to understand that the amygdala is involved in fear processing. But according to the people that study the amygdala, it's more involved in evaluative processing more generally, meaning it's important to whether you intuitively find something good or bad. Fear is the worst feeling you could be experiencing from a survival perspective, the most bad thing, so it lights up the amygdala a lot. If you have an especially large or active amygdala, that can translate into lots of things, like increased threat sensitivity, an aversion to new things, a stronger sense of right and wrong, a preference for stronger boundaries and structure in your world generally, in both a cultural and physical sense. If it sounds like I just described people who are more politically conservative, it's because I did. The neuroscience work on this topic consistently indicates that people who lean right politically have, on average, larger, more sensitive, more active amygdalas. In contrast, people who lean left are found to have similarly larger and or more active anterior cingulate cortex. Yeah, this will eventually be its own video. For now, just know that this story is more complicated than a lot of news outlets and bloggers and people in the media generally would have you believe. That's what motivated me to make this video. I've noticed a trend of people using an oversimplified representation of the amygdala to make political arguments, sweeping statements about mental health, advertise their nutraceutical shit, just lots of really dishonest and potentially harmful stuff. And I see y'all over there on the far left dehumanizing conservatives with a high school level understanding of neuroscience. Some of these fucking takes, man.
Stop it. Get some help.
Really, do I need to tell you what you sound like?
We should encourage neurodiversity, you silly cunts.
Anyway, I wanted to explain that the amygdala is orders of magnitude more complex than some on-off fear button. Anyone trying to paint it that way should be taken with a grain of salt, probably several. It's a bit like someone who thinks a car is a whatnot that rooms you from A to B and the engine makes it go, trying to pass themselves off as an automotive expert. It's simply not an accurate reflection of the science. In fact, the guy who saddled the amygdala with that fear center label in the first place, Joseph Ledoux, he's even gone back on it at this point. So please, let's try to stop calling it that. As I mentioned before, fear is very salient, and people can and do try to use it to manipulate you and others all the time. And, as we discussed in the binary thinking video, people universally start to think in more us versus them authoritarian terms when we perceive ourselves to be under threat. So we do need to chill out and reduce panic if we're going to lessen political polarization. I try to be open and transparent about my own views. I am a left-leaning person. Politically, you can hear me rant about my own views on my Twitch channel if you choose to subject yourself to that.
I'm about to fuck the shit out of this cow widow.
This was maybe the 6th time I'd fucked up this sequence, so I was starting to lose it a little bit. My video game stream is a place where I try to work out my own thoughts with other people and talk about the things that interest me, namely neuroethics, including politics and religion. It's a good time, but it's mostly a personal art project. It exists in contrast to what I'm doing here, which is a focused effort to educate and arm people. Moral fiber is intended to serve as a kind of defense against the political dark arts class, preparing you to deal with the constant onslaught of emotional and moral button pressing and lever pulling you'll encounter in politics.
Do you think he's alright?
Who cares?
I'm trying to provide fairly politically neutral, empirically driven advice on how to navigate what drives political thinking so that you can make up your own mind about things, ideally with as level a head as possible. So, yeah, getting back on track here with amygdalas, don't let anyone use amygdalas to trick your amygdala into overreacting about amygdalas, because it's gonna start a whole fucking amygdalar feedback loop, and it generates all that being said, what's the moral of the story? The amygdala is a complex, multi-part structure that does a whole lot more than just process fear. Be skeptical of anyone oversimplifying it, especially if they're making a political argument, a health claim, or trying to sell you something. Fear is a very important emotion and a very powerful motivator of behavior. However, we should forever work to make choices reflective of our hopes rather than our fears. I know that can be hard as we exist in the midst of outrage culture and the attention economy and everything else to keep that mindset, but I hope, at least with regard to the amygdala, you now know. Fear is only the beginning.
ready?
Like right now? No, not yet.
No, not yet.
How about now?